Subscribe.
I ended up being really split on Metroid Fusion. There are quite a few things I liked about it. For example, the atmosphere is amazing, the research station is creepy, knowing in the prologue what happened there, as well as Samus being down on her luck due to almost dying from the X-Parasite, and knowing that they're the main threat makes them frightening. The game knows this too. I like how the devs really used the soundtrack to their advantage this time, like how the main deck's music changes drastically depending on the current mission. Samus also controls pretty well in this game. The only real complaint I have there is that aiming diagonally down felt awkward to me, having to press down slightly after the diagonal aim button. Never really got used to it, but luckily there's not a lot of times where you would have to do that. I thought the bosses were pretty fun as well. Most were more involved than other bosses in the series, where here I couldn't really tank damage and spam missiles as much. I had to be more diligent in recognizing patterns. Then there's the bad stuff. While I like the story and atmosphere, I hate how this game handles progression. Metroid Fusion is without a doubt the most hand-holdy game I've played in the series, and it caused me a lot of problems. For one, it killed the excitement of exploring the map. Being given a waypoint isn't always a terrible thing, but there isn't any room to mess around during the journey other than for bonus items. The critical path is always the same. This later caused me a lot of frustration when Adam eventually stopped talking or you were meant to progress without his assistance, because when you were finally set free, I felt ill-equipped to explore. I never bothered to learn the map or the tricks of the station beforehand because I never needed to. It doesn't help that whenever my hand was let go, progression was always behind some unassuming block or invisible wall. By far my least favorite aspect of Metroid design. I don't mind when bonus pickups are hidden behind walls and whatnot, but when it's required for progression, it just feels like cheap, unnecessary padding. And so at the end of the game, I felt conflicted. My favorite aspects were brought to 11, but so were my least favorites. Metroid Fusion is a game of highs and lows for me, and at the end of the day, I guess I just ended up somewhere in the middle.
6 out of 10!
Metroid Zero Mission is so close to being perfect for me. I had a blast going through this game. It was one of the few games where my first thought after beating it was to play it again. Zebes has a lot of atmosphere, but every enemy and route remains clear and readable. The map is simple and gives the player all the information they need to know to find their way. The music is also great, being remixes of classic tunes, but unfortunately the GBA's notoriously bad sound chip diminishes this a bit. However, the gameplay is fast and responsive. I never felt like I wasn't in control of Samus, and that makes traversal and hunting for secrets seamless. You still get a lot of puzzles to solve in this virtual playground, making use of your upgrades in clever ways. It's the quintessential Metroid game, if it weren't for a couple things. First, the game is incredibly short. It feels like the game starts winding down just as it hits its stride. The game is also on the easier side, which I didn't find to be much of an issue until I encountered the last section. Honestly, I don't much like the last stealth section. I admire the attempt at storytelling, roping us back in for another act, but it does feel a little drawn out. Also, the easy difficulty in the main game contrasts harshly with this part. It was the only time I got a little frustrated with Zero Mission. If it weren't for these two issues, this would have to be my favorite Metroid game as of writing, but even with these issues, it's still a fantastic game.
9 out of 10!
Before you ask, no, I am not a Narnia fan. I've never read the books or seen the movie. This came with my used GBA, so it went on the list. Narnia for the GBA is a licensed video game. What more do I have to say? I think it loosely follows the events of the film, but I can't say for sure. The pre-rendered 3D visuals look pretty bad on the tiny screen of the GBA. Things are difficult to make out, and thus it's easy to get lost at a few points, even though this is an incredibly linear game. And the music is there too. The funny part about this is that I actually made it all the way through. It wasn't a very enjoyable experience. At its best, it's an average adventure game, and at its worst, it's clunky and confusing. But at no point did I end up quitting. I didn't have any real fun. Narnia for the GBA just kinda happened to me. But points for trying, I guess.
4 out of 10!
I often enjoy going back to Sonic Advance for a little burst of fun. All of its themes feel very reminiscent of the classic series. Not exactly the same, characters are given their modern looks, the music feels a little more inspired by the 3D games of its time, and gameplay doesn't feel exactly the same. Still, it's a solid interpretation of the classic 2D games, and thus a lot of the fun I had with those games carries over. Even though it's a pretty short game, I like doing a run with each character to see how far I can get. I like the gimmicks each one has to make traversal just a little different. different. Yes, I even like playing as Amy. She isn't as fast or nimble as the others, but it feels like a refreshing challenge every time. I enjoy Sonic Advance's level design for most of the adventure, but the last few levels check one or all of my pet peeves with levels at some point. First, killing the pace. I don't mind a stop and go style of play, but I'd rather choose to slow down for my own safety than to have to wait for a platform or something. Stuff like that feels out of my control and takes me out of it. Second, lots of instant death mechanics as a means to increase difficulty. Yeah, I'm talking about the bottomless pits. Sonic Advance gets a little carried away with these later on. And lastly, screen crunch. Some might chalk this up to the GBA's lack of real estate, but I never really felt unjustly punished for something I couldn't see earlier in the game, so I think it might have something to do with the levels themselves. Or maybe a bit of both. At the end of the day, I still think Sonic Advance has more going for it than against it. The tail end of the game can be rough, but I still enjoy just about everything else so much that I find myself coming back more than I would have thought, even if I don't beat the whole thing.
7 out of 10!
I admire what Sonic Advance 3 tried to do to change things up. I think the team-up mechanic is a great idea. For a while, Sonic has had a buddy on screen, but it never really had any huge gameplay implications. The roster of characters allows for a bunch of interesting combinations, and I like seeing each pair's gameplay differences. When it comes to the actual levels, though, things kind of fall apart. I managed to go through most of the game without using these abilities at all. Most of the time, I'd have my pair for aesthetic reasons and just rush through as usual. It felt like the devs weren't sure how to properly implement all of the different styles of teams. In Advance 3, I actually decided to go after the Chaos Emeralds, and boy, that was a mistake. Finding all 10 Chao is a chore, and the special stages have no real sense of depth. Needless to say, I gave up after a few tries. I also gotta say, I don't like the hub worlds. It would be much easier to have all the levels lined up and easily accessible, but for some reason they were turned into mazes. It makes getting to the levels a challenge in itself, and not in a fun way. Outside of this, it has all the same pros and cons of the original Advance to me. The level design is a little more focused on pure speed, but the late stretch is again filled with level design choices I don't really like bottomless pits and not compensating for screen crunch. There is less waiting in this game, but I think the other faults round Sonic Advance 3 to about the same spot.
7 out of 10!
I really wanted to like Sonic Battle. A Sonic fighting game could be a cool idea, but there were a lot of things that went wrong here. The biggest and most unfortunate problem is that this was on the GBA, meaning you have to force a very limited control scheme. This doesn't bode well for fighting games, the best of which are based around precise spacing and an arsenal of attacks. Here you only have a couple basic combos from what I can tell, and it makes combat incredibly stale. It also doesn't help that they throw so many of these fights at you. First get 5 kills, then 10, then another against 3 opponents, all in a row. It gets tiring fast. For most fights, I ended up just spamming my character's best move until it was over. Whether that's the kick that spikes the opponent into the ground for easy juggles, or the special bomb attack that you can just lay down and watch the AI walk into. That's another thing. The AI isn't very smart. They're super aggressive, which makes them hard at first, but then you can get away with running around in circles until they just die. That ends up being the winning strategy as well, since later enemies can kill you in only a few hits. It's mind-numbing. I thought the story was okay. Well, it was fun to read some of the dialogue, since this game gives a lot more character to some of Sonic's friends than other games. My favorite part about Sonic Battle is the art by a long shot. I really like the more etched, rough style they went with, and there are some cool animations in the game as well. At least I can look at those while I turn my brain off during combat. This one wasn't really that great outside of those things, and unfortunately I was left disappointed. Maybe someday we'll get a proper fleshed out attempt at a fighting game.